Great. So thank you to CIBI for the invitation. Um, I developed this talk originally at the request of the Inter-American Development Bank for something that Uruguay wanted because they're thinking of doing screwworm eradication, but it seemed relevant to the needs of this group. So, uh, I'll give it and just think about maybe some of the lessons also apply to the U.S. and I'll point out where that applies. And then, as Jeff said, I mostly, for most of my career, did blowfly work on the blowflies that eat you after you've died. And so, when I got into this research, I collaborated with John Welch and Pamela Phillips and some other colleagues that have a much deeper history working with the primary screwworm and leishmaniasis causing fly. So John Welch, who is now retired but may be rehired soon to help with this re-eradication effort, he's contributed a lot to my understanding of screwworms in general and to this talk specifically. And so this is a little bit benefiting from his decades of experience as well. So I live in Texas with livestock. We have about 30 goats, some horses. This cow lived on our property for about a year. This is Maple. I don't want screwworms on my property any more than anyone else. And so my wife and I are alert to things in the news. We would like to not have our animals eaten alive. I'm not the spokesperson for the USDA, though, and I know that there's a huge need for information and understanding. So I'm just pointing to some resources right now. The USDA does have a pretty good page on the current situation with screwworm outbreaks, the history of the program, etc. So I would suggest going there as the kind of official word on what's happening with eradication. Briefly, what happened was, this is a fly that will parasitize vertebrates. We count, its Latin name is Cochlearia omnivorax, which implies that they might eat us voraciously. They are pests of cattle, sheep, deer, and pretty much pick a vertebrate. There's some cases if it's an important vertebrate to us in human society. And so this is a problem that was endemic to the US for many years. And in the 1930s, I do some Drosophila research, so I'm proud of this. There was a Drosophila researcher, Muller, who figured out that you could damage Drosophila chromosomes, and there were some genetics consequences to that were helpful. But that spurred some conversation with USDA employees about if this observation could be leveraged to do sterile insect technique work with pest flies. And so the fly that was most kind of on the list was this Cochlearia omnivorax, the primary screwworm, that parasitizes wounds and lays hundreds of larvae or eggs that end up hatching into larvae that eat you alive. Nobody wants that. I like to ask the question, raise your hand if you want to be eaten alive by maggots. Nobody answers an affirmative. And so this is a big priority. Unfortunately, that priority got paused by World War II, but when the folks at the USDA came back from World War II, they went right back to working on eradication. And so there is this process, which you can see in this map, of releasing a bunch of sterilized flies in an area. The original observation was with X-ray. X-ray technology has some technical limitations, which at the time made it beneficial to move over to cobalt-60 as the ionizing radiation source for this. You basically expose factory-reared numbers of flies to ionizing radiation, damage their reproductive tissues, but it's a low enough dose that you don't actually harm the rest of the fly. So adults can eclose from their puparia, they can fly around and mate with other flies, but the benefit is you've damaged the chromosomes to the point where those are infertile matings when those flies that you've released encounter wild flies. And so you basically just factory your insects, irradiate the insects, release them in the wild, let them mate with the wild ones. And you can suppress a population to the point of local extinction. So you can see here it took 2 years to eradicate the southeast. In the Southwest, it took a little longer, and we'll talk about that when you want to get your head around how these programs work and experiences with this. But we have been on a march since essentially the time I was born until 2000, pushing that fly down to Panama. And there was a 20-year period where we maintained a sterile screwworm production facility in Panama, which is still active. And about 2023, those flies are starting to get into, they got across the Isthmus of Panama, and we're getting cases there, and then Costa Rica. And at this point, we have them kind of in that green zone on this map in Mexico is where they've returned. They're kind of in the vicinity of Veracruz. And so there's an active effort to keep these suppressed, and hopefully we can keep them from getting to Texas, which will likely be the first state to be hit. But there's no guarantee we will keep them suppressed, and so there's lots of question, concern about what we do when they get here. And that's where I would point you to the USDA resources. If you're interested in the history of this, The Peaceful Atom and the Deadly Fly by Scruggs is a great kind of summary of how all this got going. All right. It's also worth thinking about this. So South America has lived with this problem for this whole time, where the US and Mexico and Central America have been screwworm free. So they still deal with challenges. There's a lot of work. There's this great publication on the predicted distributions of screwworms in South America and predicted corridors of movement if you're worried about movement of screwworms across South America. And there are countries thinking about eradicating with SIT in South America. So Uruguay is one of them. I was invited to talk to their National Agricultural Expo earlier this year about this, and the thought would be to partner with Argentina. You can see they are surrounded by countries that also have high screwworm densities, so their situation might be a little different than trying to eradicate in Panama, or the situation in Mexico right now, or in the US, what we'll be dealing with. But yeah, they deal with it in their own way, and we will probably be needing to learn from them what works and what doesn't work, and what we're willing to do, and the list of things that work in North America. So one of the major points is, though, when it works really well. So if you look at that Southeast example, that was a rapid eradication in the US Southeast. And, Nippling and Bushland got the World Food Prize for this. And that was the flagship SIT program in the USDA. And there's now hundreds of these across the globe for different insect pests. But it's a pretty common technique. Is you raise a lot of an insect, you irradiate that insect, you release it in the wild, and suppress or eliminate the population you're targeting. So this is the first time anyone had done this successfully. And this program's been kind of the example that a lot of programs look to because of that. And there is a huge consequence in Texas for this. So this is a common table that you'll see floating around, stemming from a 1976 analysis of the economics of the screwworm eradication effort. And there's a few things to look at here. If you look in the 1976 column, they at the time had about 7 million cattle, but now look at the next column, 20% infestation rate. Right, so that's the kind of problem we'll be dealing with if we get screwworms back in the US. And that has some consequences for how we ranch today versus how we used to ranch. I think it's fair to say that we ranch today in Texas and in the US because our practices reflect the fact that we haven't had to deal with this pest in a long time. And you can look at the cost for treating each animal. You can look at the sheep and goat population, the same thing, a little bit lower infestation rate. And significant amounts of money that add up. And over the years, there have been efforts to update for inflation. But one thing that hasn't been done here, and is worth thinking about, is the cattle population. I'm sure some people in this talk might be more familiar with the industry than me, but I checked recently, and I think we're more like at 12 million cattle in Texas right now. The white-tailed deer population was also very different. I'm told that in the time of screwworm eradication, you could count the white-tailed deer population in the thousands, and now we count them in the millions in Texas. So that's also a species that will be impacted. And if you talk to people in industry about deer, that's not a trivial industry. People make a lot of money off of the deer in Texas. So there's all these, and we have wild hogs we didn't used to have. Our interest in maintaining the health of our pets likely changed in the last several decades. So the costs that are reported here are probably an underreport of like the cost of what this fly will do when it gets to us. And essentially, part of this information tells us, should we bother with screwworm eradication? Because the cost to operate this is much lower than the benefit. So that's usually a no-brainer. Yeah, you should do this because it's cheaper to control it than deal with the consequences of not controlling it. So another thing that kind of comes up when you talk to people that have been involved in screwworm eradication, like John, and also if you just pay attention to the history, there's clearly a politics-science interaction thing going on. We know how to do things, but you have to marshal the resources to do them. It's worth looking at the international effort of eradication versus what happened in the US. We went from Florida to Texas with a hiccup in a few decades, and it was a little bit slower march going through Central and South America. And part of that was political. The USDA had to communicate with each and every government and define the conditions whereby it would be acceptable to do these releases. Each country had a limit on what it could contribute back in the effort. And this, it was a political process to walk all the way down to Panama, which is, why it's not a surprise that it took a while to get there, to Panama. When you think about politics and science too, it's worth thinking about Libya's infestation. So in the 1980s and 90s, there were screwworms in Libya. Does anybody remember the political environment between the US and Libya in that time? Anybody want to say if it was good or bad?
It was bad.
It was bad. Yeah, it was bad. Probably like the worst case scenario you can the resource that could help, and Libya would need it. But I think it's worth noting that through the FAO and the IAEA, Libya found a way to work with the US to eradicate this fly. This is that bad of a problem, right? And so they were able to work with the US, and over the course of, what is it, 4 years, eradicate the fly. And that would have been a problem had it escaped from Libya, because then you'd be talking about another part of the world that would have had a huge challenge and economic issues that they didn't currently deal with. And if you look at the return on our current outbreak, it was much faster than the political effort that went into eradicating Central and South America. It took about 2 years to get back here. So it's worth thinking about how politics interacts with science in this particular effort. And there's lots of dimensions to that, but it's definitely something to think about. When you think about this too, there's a dimension of this, and I'm not making a judgment in any particular direction, but if you read Vrayson et al.'s kind of description of when eradication programs through SIT work and don't work, they consider various things. And one part of that is, does the technical staff, the scientific staff make the decisions? Does administrative staff make the decisions, or do business interests make the decisions? Ultimately, like when there's a choice point, who's making the call? And there are consequences to each and every choice there about who's running the show. And I think it would be fair to say that all of these groups would have different incentive structures, different specific concerns, different people they report to, et cetera. And different consequences to them if a failure occurs. All we're thinking about any program, how it's structured might impact its function. I think it's also worth noting that there will be setbacks. We are currently in a setback, so it's kind of obvious. But you need to think about this always as this concept of setbacks. So if you look at the Southwestern eradication, we thought by 66 we had it done. And then in 1972, we had a resurgence, which was attributed to rancher fatigue. And the reason that happens is, you need to be regularly checking your animals for infestation. And if you find it, you need to do some work on that animal, which takes time and money, to clear that infestation so it doesn't spread further. And just to give you an idea, I ate lunch with a Brazilian rancher that works in Brazil and Uruguay, and he was describing calving season. You need to check every animal twice a day to avoid screwworm infestation. So if you think about Texas ranchers that have a property that's not in the same county as their domicile, that with lots of animals, that could be a problem to do a twice a day check, right? So that's a consequence maybe of having eradicated the fly the way we ranch now might be a problem for monitoring our animals. And I'm told that a common practice when screwworms were in Texas was that all the kids in the family went and checked all the animals every day. And there were operations that had a lot more cowboy employees than they currently have, if any. Some ranchers have no cowboy employees other than the family that owns the animals. And so, that kind of situation led to, this resurgence, and it took a while to actually certify Texas as fully done with the eradication effort. And then you have periodic outbreaks. We already talked about Libya. The Caribbean islands have had a few. There was a prominent one in Florida, in the Florida Keys between 2016 and 2017. That had a big impact temporarily, thankfully, on the key deer in the Florida Keys. And then now we've got the current return to Mexico. So these programs work, but they're not set in stone. Once you've cleared an area, it doesn't mean it can't come back later. And that really puts you in kind of this idea of thinking that you're in some sort of weird macabre dance with the flies. It doesn't look like the tango. It looks more like this Wikipedia dance. But what I get out of that is over time you can change the location of the dance. But by its nature, you will not be in the same place for all time. And we were lucky for 20 some odd years. We had that fly controlled and located in Panama and not north of Panama for the most part. But that, if you look at the history of this, there are times where it gets loose, and that's a potential reinfestation event. And this go around, we're having more serious challenges, and people are becoming more concerned with that particular issue. Because of this, vigilance is important, right? So that was a major issue with the Texas reinfestation, was the rancher fatigue. But there's other kinds of vigilance that need to happen too. So you need to think of this as a long-term investment. I'm not going to release flies today and tomorrow I don't have to think about this problem anymore. And if you think about human psychology, well, I could spray an insecticide and get rid of this problem. Right? There's lots of examples of how to properly and not properly use insecticides, where you might create more problems for yourself down the line. And it's easier to get into trouble, I would argue, when you have a long-term investment involved, where you're not seeing the payout tomorrow. It's also, when you're in the situation that the US is currently in, easy to forget the reason you did the investment, right? I'm sure every one of us has gone through our bills and you find this moment where you're like, why am I paying this bill still, right? And you need to keep in mind like why this program exists. It was to the benefit economically of ranchers in the US and Central America and Texas specifically for us. But we can't even imagine a life with screwworms anymore. Doesn't mean we shouldn't keep paying for the effort. But it's also easy to imagine that it just, at some point, this information drifts from the collective memory. Not too many people remember the screwworms and what it was like to live with them. If you talk to ranchers that were around in the 60s, they remember. And every year that goes by, there are fewer of them and more people that have no experience with this problem. And that makes it a political problem in general too, right? Because once you forget why you're paying for something, it's easy to cross the line item off the list or mix it with other line items and not be as vigilant as you used to be. That's just human nature, and it's just something to think about with these programs. It's also worth noting, though, even in the 60s, when the program was working, people were being called to Congress to testify as to whether or not this was a worthwhile effort. So this is a 1969 report from the Comptroller General to Congress about this program. Is it worth it? And my understanding is what happened with this kind of initial burst of concern of cost is it led to that 1976 economic report, which made it pretty clear that the costs were much bigger than the cost of the program. So if you control this fly, it was worthwhile. And so that's just a thing to think about, is that, there are different forces in society, and, I don't think anyone judges Congress for wanting to make sure it's doing the right thing with its money. But there's this justification process that comes with this program and other SIT programs as well. And you can also imagine different pests are different levels of risk to society. So maybe we don't need to do this for every pest anyway, right? So just depending on what you're thinking about, there may be different reasons to do or not do an eradication effort with SIT. There's also, this kind of ties into some other things. People now are deciding that mosquito eradication is at a local level worth it in some cases, because technology has changed in the mosquito world enough that for species where you can separate males and females by size efficiently, you can irradiate just the males, release them, and get a pretty good local suppression effort. So there are things happening in that area, and this Bouillet et al. Publication kind of covers, if you're thinking of an eradication effort with SIT, first you're just kind of monitoring what your populations are and deciding which species you want to target for eradication. And then the last stage is kind of where the Screwworm program is just innovation and evaluation, keeping track of what's happening. Are there ways to improve it, become more efficient? The situation on the ground is changing. That's what that macabre dance with the flies is about. But in general, you can get progress with these programs. It's also worth thinking that you're not obliged to do it the way it's been done before. This particular program has always been an innovator in SIT because it's the flagship. But there are lots of things that change over time that might improve efficiency, might help deal with a certain choke point in the process. So I do research on E-beam with, so far it's been with Cochleameia macellaria, which is a sister species to Cochleameia omnivorax, which is the screwworm that everyone's concerned about. Other people do X-ray research, but these are ionizing radiation sources that come with different benefits and disadvantages than cobalt and cesium, which are typically used in SIT programs. And part of that has to do with the fact that you don't want orphan sources of cobalt or cesium in society. You could deactivate a city the size of Houston for decades if you do it right. So there's interest in making sure we know where all the radioactive isotopes are and that they're protected. E-beam, you can't do that. You just plug into the wall, you shoot electrons, you can create ionizing radiation, but then you can turn it off. The cost structures are different, and you don't have to recalibrate because of the half-life. So that actually becomes an efficiency and operations thing when you don't have to stop periodically and decide how long you're treating the flies today versus last week. And it's also worth keeping in mind that really this is not about eradicating a fly. You can think of this as an IPM strategy, integrated pest management, that can lead to eradication if you coordinate with other efforts. But really, this is just about population suppression, which, when it works perfectly, does eradicate the insect. But with mosquitoes, it's clear that you don't expect to eradicate mosquitoes, but you can suppress mosquitoes. And so different programs that do SIT have different goals that have to do with the nature of that particular insect, and if you think you can even get away with eradicating, or if you just need to suppress. And so, I like to point out that those scenarios are different, so your innovation might be important there. How you deal with helping Uruguay eradicate when it's got two neighbors that also have high fly densities is, you probably want to encourage them to think about suppression and other integrated pest management strategies. Panama is very different. They had a very narrow land bridge. You think about that challenge differently. And then for us now, I wouldn't think spatially so much as temporally. Texas today does not look like Texas decades ago in the way that we do animal farming, the way that we have pets, the way the human population moves around, and how many people live indoors versus outdoors. All these things impact whether or not you're going to have unexpected challenges with the re-eradication effort if they get to Texas again. And I think the big one is the way people ranch. The number of employees checking animals every day is vastly different than it used to be. And that's probably going to be the major thing that we need to consider moving forward. So here's just some of our e-beam work. We've done simulations to show that you can get the target dose that you need to eradicate flies. You can look here at these ovaries down in the bottom. 1 and 2 grade ovaries are not going to create a reproductively capable individual. So when we do the e-beam treatments with high energy e-beam, we get that sort of result. And when you do control treatments, you often get the ovaries that look like the 3 and 4, where 5 would be about ready to lay eggs. So very vast difference in the flies when we treat them with e-beam, and that looks a lot like what those ovaries in females look like when you treat them with cobalt-60. We've done other comparisons. There's all sorts of life history work we've done and flow cytometry to see what the cell cycle situation seems to be and what kind of genetic damage you've done by doing these treatments. It looks promising. It looks like you should be able to swap technologies and reap the benefits of not having to use cobalt in the future. But there is a lot of work in that area to do. There's interest in directly working with screwworms on this, and lots of other technologies that people are trying. There's a whole genetic strain approach where you make genetic tools that can basically reproduce the ionizing radiation effect, but the point would be the same. You release a lot of sterile insects and suppress the population. But overall, I would say that screwworms are worth the eradication effort. We've got the Texas economic numbers, but we also think they're probably, at least I think, they're probably an underreport of the economic costs of the screwworm. Just from a humanitarian perspective, right, they are a pathogen, essentially. They will eat us. There's some disgusting, these are the most disgusting photos I have, are just oral myiasis of a human. You've got livestock and pets that are affected. So you can see here, there's a horse that's got an infestation kind of on its neck. These are things you're going to have to deal with in Texas if we have, or anywhere else in the U.S. if we have a re-exposure. But it's livestock. It's also pets, and our relationship to our pets nowadays is a little different than decades ago. So those costs are likely higher and evaluated as higher by us. The wildlife impact, I think the example of the white-tailed deer tells you that you will probably expect some sort of change in the wildlife if you have screwworms in the environment. Definitely deer are likely to be impacted. We know it's economic, but then there's also ecological things. So if you don't have SIT working, then people start thinking about using insecticides. And depending on how you use insecticides, you could have a big impact on the environment. And you might also impact other operations in this list if you start treating broadly and then some other pests develop insecticide resistance, and now you've got 2 problems instead of just the screwworm problem. I'm also told by John that in Central and South America, ranchers are not fond of letting their cattle graze under trees because of screwworms. So you can think about deforestation kind of issues maybe being tied to concerns like this, right? It's like, oh, I can kind of understand why you might want to cut trees now if your cattle are infested when they go under trees. You also have that key deer infestation. It wasn't a disaster, but it could have been. People at Texas A&M came back later, among others, and it was a sizable impact on the population as far as how many deer died from the re-exposure to screwworms. But the biggest thing was most of those were bucks that died. And so, whenever you have an impact on one sex more than the other, you could, in theory, have a big impact on the population genetics of the species. Sounds like it wasn't that bad, but it could have been, and you can imagine other organisms we might want to protect that won't be as lucky as the key deer in Florida in 2016. Now, let's get to CB kind of things. So I have been on PhD committees of a number of Jeff Tomberlin students who are interested in factory scale production of black soldier flies. I've seen lots of images like these that Jeff was gracious enough to provide to me. And I gotta say, they look very similar to the Screwworm operation. Factory scale production of blowflies, factory scale production of black soldier flies has a lot of similarities, a lot of similar challenges, a lot of similar approaches. Things like, letting the flies leave the container, they end up in a half pipe of PVC pipe, and then you scoop those up and put them in the next tray. There's a lot of things I think that the communities can learn from one another. I suspect on the industrial side, there's more innovation happening that might be able to be introduced to the Screwworm side of things or other SIT operations. And these SIT operations have been in existence sometimes much longer than some of the insect farming groups. So there may be some things that you could learn from those operations as far as like long-term challenges. Maybe getting up and running looks similar, but then after decades of operating, what happens? What are your choke points then? But things like trays and racks, the footprint and the scale, some of the risks are similar. You don't want a disease ripping through your population. And there are examples of, if you don't put formaldehyde in the food and there's a technical reason why that didn't happen, you get challenges making enough flies to release, that sort of thing. And that's very similar to, we have an ag forensics faculty member who was studying a virus that killed a lot of superworms. Same kind of challenge. So I think there's a lot of overlap here where there could be cross-pollination, but there's a huge biosecurity difference. And I don't want to say that insect farming doesn't already involve biosecurity, but if a black soldier fly escapes, there's potentially consequences to that. But it's not like if a screwworm escapes, where it's not guaranteed, but somebody could die. An animal could die. And by die, we mean eaten alive by maggots, if it happens. That's a different kind of consequence. So the security of operations are likely to differ. And I think that's a major challenge. I've heard in a number of ways and from different perspectives about dual use facilities. Sometimes this is dual use SIT program to SIT program. Some of the discussions about how the South Texas facility that was announced recently is, can we have a flexible facility that can sometimes be making screwworms and sometimes be making something else? There's discussions about, can you sometimes have industrial partners help with their facilities? But in all cases, you need to think about what is the concept of raising this fly in a biosecure fashion, and does that overlap with whatever the other dual component is? And so that's something to think about, and I bet your group is positioned to think carefully and effectively about it. But I think that's a major difference between what I've seen with soldier fly rearing, which I suspect also overlaps with all of your ag industrial kinds of insect rearing interests. But that's really what I have to say, and I think we probably have lots of questions that people have and want to talk about. So I'm just going to acknowledge some colleagues. So there's Alvaro, who invited me to give the original talk in Uruguay. My colleagues at the E-beam Center, colleagues at the USDA. John's already a co-author, so I didn't thank him here, but he's definitely benefited from his knowledge enough to make him a co-author on this talk. The colleagues at Texas A&M that have been doing the work in my lab or have been providing the samples, and then NSA and the Office of Radiological Security have funded our E-beam work initially. Now we might be getting USDA partnering as well, but all these partners together kind of contribute to our ability to do what we were talking about.